Hey guys, Cam from Audi 3.0t owners. Just wanted to talk to you guys before we get into this DIY to tell you all about it. So obviously this is our DIY on divorcing your supercharger coolant loop from your entire engine coolant loop. And the reason we want to do this is that allows us to run any kind of amount of distilled water in the supercharger coolant loop, which obviously the water is what has the cooling properties. Your antifreeze is what keeps your system from freezing in cold weather. So having said that, if you choose to run distilled water, make sure you only do so in climates that won't freeze when it gets really cold. So if you're in a cold weather climate, you need to not run just distilled water if you're in freezing temperatures for extended amounts of time. So do this at your own risk. But one big thing, this is for the C7 platform. This will be very similar for your B8s, especially your B8s. They have the same setup, and your B8.5s will be very similar. Not quite the same though, the way the piping is routed, but the whole concept's about the same. We're basically deleting all of the OEM coolant hoses, which I can show you over here. Mine are just kind of chilling there now. You can see the hard lines resting over there. And we're running an all new line system that's gonna go to everything. This is the reservoir here. Now for you C7 owners who want to buy this kit from MercRacing, be advised that this is not a kit you can purchase yet. This kit is basically in development with us and Jose from MercRacing. We got the bracket design. He's got to produce those for the C7 platform. We've got to come up with exactly how much of tubing and hosing and turns and all sorts of things like that to come up with an install kit for the C7 platform. So as of right now, you can't go out and buy this kit, but it will be available soon from Jose at MercRacing. As soon as it comes available, I'll update the description of this video with the link to the product so you can buy it. But hope you guys enjoy the video. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Make sure you like and subscribe, especially like us on Instagram. If you're not already, we're really active over there. Then hope you guys enjoy the video. Welcome back to Audi 3.0t owners, everybody. This is our DIY video on divorcing your supercharger coolant loop from your cooling system. If you don't know why you want to do this, and I know there's gonna be a lot of people that pop into these comments talking about, oh, 34 Motorsports did a video showing this doesn't do anything. And they're right to a degree, but there's a couple things we're doing with this system. But we're gonna be showing you how to divorce the supercharger coolant loop, and the big benefit of this is, there's a few benefits, but the biggest one is we're gonna be able to isolate the supercharging coolant loop and put in straight distilled water if we want to, or we can put any kind of mix of water to antifreeze that we want. And why would you want to do that, you ask? The big reason is our constant chase to keep IATs down. That's what you're trying to do with this car. The lower they are, the better for the health of the engine, the better for the health of the supercharger, and the better performance you're going to get with this car. If you don't know this, cooling effect from like coolant, the cooling effect is actually from the water part of your coolant. So like if you go to Audi and you buy the G13 50/50, that 50/50 means it's 50% distilled water and 50% antifreeze. If you run just straight distilled water, you're gonna get a much better cooling effect than you are running any kind of mix. Warning, do not run straight distilled water if you are in a cold weather environment with freezing temperatures. If this stuff freezes, if you put distilled water in and it freezes, freezing causes water to expand and you're going to have a bad time. So only do this if you are in a warm environment and you know full well that you are not gonna have a freezing issue. Like me, I'm in Southeast North Carolina. I can run straight distilled water all through summer and into fall. And then at that point, I'm going to drain it and I'm gonna probably put in either 50/50 or I might go like a 70/30 mix, something like that, because it's garage kept. I don't see extended freezing temperatures. Just keep that in mind, okay? And don't blame me if you screw that up. But anyways, we'll be able to run straight distilled water with some water wetter in there and really bring those IATs down. The other thing that's gonna do is it's gonna make maintenance a lot easier because we're going to be setting this up so that the heat exchanger from MercRacing is going to be connected to our new Divorced Reservoir and be able to auto bleed. And I'll show all of that in this video, how to do it, what it's gonna be like. I'll show you the reservoir. The reservoir's over here. Now you can't buy this reservoir from MercRacing just quite yet. We're doing some testing here to make sure it works on this car. But you can see here, these are the mounts for it. That's gonna be where your exit pipe comes in out of the reservoir. This right here is the barb for the heat exchanger tube. The tube from the heat exchanger is going to run to this, and it's going to constantly put new coolant, water, whatever you're gonna run into here, and that's what's gonna allow this system to auto bleed. This is our bracket. This is a prototype bracket we're gonna be using on the car today. MercRacing will eventually have a kit out for the C7s. But yeah, so let's get into this DIY. I'm gonna go over what you should do before you start anything, what you need to do to prep the car for this job. And yeah, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. As always, guys, please comment for anything, that's great, but like the video, subscribe to the channel, and if you haven't already, if you've got Instagram, please go to Instagram and follow us on Instagram. We're like 400 people away from 2,000 subscribers on Instagram, or 2,000 followers. Once we get there, we can give away some free stuff. Once we get done with this video and we get this divorce set up and everything, we will be doing some giveaways for MercRacing gear as well. So if you like that, if you like free stuff, if you like the channel, if you like the content, please help us out and share it around, spread the love. Let's get into this. Okay, so the first thing you need to do for this job is you need to set everything up. As you can see, my supercharger's off the car. You don't need to remove your supercharger. Mine is off because I was replacing a PCV breather tube, found out that I had a leaky intercooler core, and so I'm waiting for replacement parts and it's going back on here. So you don't need to replace your supercharger, but you have to obviously remove your top of your cover here, which is easy to do. You need to be able to see this and access your heat exchanger. Underneath the car, you need to remove your skid plates underneath. You need to remove the little skid plate that connects your bumper to your main skid plates because you need to access the bottom of the supercharger. Over here on this side of the car, let me show you here. Hang on. Okay, over here, and your driver's side wheel well, go ahead and remove your fender liners. It's where you have access to your coolant pump because you're gonna need direct access to that. You can see I've got my upper and lower fender liners out of the way. There's nothing there because we're gonna be doing a lot of work underneath the car here. So make sure you have access to that. You need the car obviously jacked up. Go ahead and drain your coolant system. If you don't know how to do that, check out our video on that. I'll have it linked in the description below. Get as much of it out and so that you don't have to deal with that. And then what we're gonna do is familiarize ourselves with our coolant system. So if you have no idea how the coolant system on this car works, you need to take a few moments to get underneath the car, look at it from on top, and I'm gonna have a couple of charts here or diagrams, things to help you visualize this. So I'll put one up on the screen here so you can see, you can pause it, screenshot it. I'll have a link to the actual picture in the description below as well, hopefully. But that'll show you what the OEM coolant system is. Now, for anybody who's got a S4, that chart is the same for B8s, but not B8.5s. B8s and C7s have the same design where the OEM coolant system comes in from the passenger side and out through the driver's side. The B8.5s don't. They're both on the driver's side. So this will be a little bit different for them if you guys are trying to do this. But familiarize yourself with that. Get everything done, get underneath the car, look it up, compare it to the diagrams to where you absolutely know what everything is doing. The next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna think about this in chunks, in sections, okay? So first thing I want you to think about is your OEM reservoir going to your radiator, okay? That's one part. That is feeding coolant. It goes straight down and there's a, here, let me zoom in here. If you can see right in there, that little, metal pipe there, that metal pipe goes from the bottom of your reservoir down into your radiator. Now, we are going to be capping part of this to where that's all it does because it comes to a T-fix down here, if you can see right there. That T-fix, hopefully I'll try and highlight this with an arrow or something, but that T-fix, that's what it's going to. We're going to be retrofitting this and capping it off to the only thing that the OEM reservoir is doing is feeding coolant into your OEM radiator, because that is what is going to feed coolant into your engine, okay? When we're done with this, that's the only thing this is gonna do. It's gonna send coolant to your radiator, into your engine, to your heater core, to, you know, do all the stuff with your HVAC, and that's it. We're going to be separating the supercharger coolant loop, and that runs from your supercharger to your heat exchanger, or vice versa, from your heat exchanger to your supercharger down into your coolant pump and back and forth, okay? So think about that. That's one section. Your next section, think about these hard lines right here. If you see these two lines, these connect to your supercharger right here, okay? And there are hard lines that you can see right here. Those go down, and one goes to the left, one goes to the right, okay? We, in this video, and you don't have to do this, but we are gonna be deleting these hard lines. I think they're 5/16 hard lines, and we are going to be getting rid of this completely and replacing this with 3/4 inch rubber tubing. That'll create a little bit more flow. That's gonna not really aid in your ITs going down, but it will aid in recovery because you're gonna have a faster flow. We've got the CW100 on there, so that's already helping, but we're gonna go down there. It's connected at the bottom. There's a little bolt at the bottom down there, and we're gonna be disconnecting that and getting rid of it. We're gonna be deleting all the metal and just running straight up rubber lines. So that's section number 2. Section number 3 is going to be everything you do with the OEM or your CW100 coolant pump, which is right there, okay? So we're gonna show you how to modify all that. So 3 sections that you're gonna have to deal with: OEM reservoir, your lines, and the coolant pump. So I'm gonna try and explain this stuff as easy as I can and show you what I do as I go along with it. I hope it makes sense. Please ask questions in the comments. Let me know if anything's unclear. I'll have these diagrams for you. I'm gonna have a diagram showing the setup for the divorce system, and I'll show you how to do this. Then I'll show you how to bleed the system once you divorce it, and I'll show you how to make sure that everything's running right. So here we go. I'm going to start by starting to remove the hard lines. So these, obviously you're gonna have your supercharger here. Mine, I don't. This is gonna be bolted in. Right now it's really easy to access because I don't have a supercharger here. But if you don't know, right here, this bracket is held into the engine by a 30 Torx bit. So you need to get something in there that you can remove that one bolt, and that's gonna allow this to back out. You've got these 2 angled rubber hoses. They connect to your entrance and exit lines for your supercharger. And they've got, you know, the pain in the butt clamps here. If you don't have one of these tools, which are specifically for these spring clamps, I highly suggest you get one. Don't be stubborn like me. I went for a long time without having these. On second thought, I'm not gonna worry about trying to remove these off of the metal pipes right now, because taking a closer look, these are reducer hoses. So this is wider here than it is here. It's so it can go from, like, you know, the nice wide coolant entrance and exit pipes from your crossover pipe to this 5/16 line. So we'll leave them on here because I don't think I'll be reusing them now that I know that. But if I do have to reuse them, then it'll be easier to take them off when the whole thing is off the car. So all you need to do here is obviously remove the top spring clamps from your supercharger so you can get these hoses off of your supercharger. And remember, there's probably going to be some residual coolant. Then remove this T30. Once you're done with that, we're going to go down below the car and we're going to disconnect the bottom of these pipes and hopefully just be able to pull this straight out the top. There's plenty of room that this should be able to just come right out of the top. And yeah, here we go. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys what it looks like underneath the car for this next step. Let me grab something first because I need to double check. Where is my T30? There you go. That is a T30. So anyways, we're going to hop under here. All right, so this is coming in underneath the car and looking directly up. So obviously this is our heat exchanger, and here's the bottom of the hard lines here. Let me zoom in a little bit or get the light adjusted. So you can see the hard line right here. You can see how it comes down from the top of the motor, right? It looks familiar. Comes in, this line goes all the way over here, and you can see this line here connected. Now this line right here literally just comes around the side, around your radiator, and that's what connects to this line of your heat exchanger. Now on the OEM setup, that line just comes around and plugs into your OEM heat exchanger. For this one, since both the entrance and exit ports are on the driver's side, we had to run this pipe all the way back over. That goes to this U-shaped piece of silicone and into the heat exchanger. So when we remove this, we're going to disconnect this line. And you can see my spring clamps are already back, and that's because I've already disconnected this to let as much coolant drain as possible. But when we delete this, this whole line here is going to be removed. But right now we're gonna focus on this. So how do you get this? If you can see right here, I'm pointing it right there. Let me see if I can move the light around here. There we go. There's one bolt right there that holds the bottom of this in. I'm gonna try this out here while I'm holding the camera, which is always fun. That is a T30. So that's a T30 Torx. We need to get something in here. So you're gonna have to have something to get in here. You know, a 1/4 inch ratchet with a 1/4 inch bit to fit one of these. Should get you in there just fine. I've got a slim, low profile ratchet, so I'm gonna use that. We're gonna unbolt that, and then going this way, you got this weird T thing in the way, but through it right there is where the rubber hose here, this one goes over towards your coolant pump here, and we're gonna talk about this in a bit, but that connects there, and so we're gonna have to get to that spring clamp, pull this off. So once we have that off, we've already got this one off over here, and we remove this bolt, that should free up the hard lines of the coolant system, and we can pull it out through the top. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that and be back when I'm done. Okay, as you can see, I got that T30 out right here. And then I kind of pulled on it to wiggle, and it wasn't super loose, and I got kind of confused, and then I realized that I missed one. There is, if you see here, another flange here, and there's a bolt on the back of this one, and it is another T30, I believe. If it's not, I'll let you guys know, but it feels like another T30. Once again, you have to have something that can get in here and get at that bolt. So this is the kind of thing I use, a little mini bit ratchet driver. When you're done, make sure you save these screws in case you have to put this back in. You could probably just get this out and put the screws back into the engine block for them to sit there, but you run the risk of them vibrating out. So I'm just gonna tape them up and put them in storage with the rest of the parts. So 2 screws, one here and one here. Okay, we got both of the screws out, and I just want to point out that one is longer than the other one. So this screw is the one that connected where the pipes kind of split, the one near the center of the hard lines. This one came off the passenger side. It's just a little bit taller. I don't know how big of a difference that makes, but I wanted to make sure that you guys saw that. Another quick tip on the hard lines here. If you remember, the whole connection was on the other side of this T-fix, and this is stuff that routes coolant and oil, or I'm sorry, stuff to your oil cooler over here. Sorry, I'm running this way. Anyways, that T-fix runs stuff over to your oil cooler. But if you remember, that was on the bottom below this spring clamp. If you get both of the bolts off of your hard lines, you can actually pull it down below, and it makes it a lot easier to access that spring clamp and remove it. So definitely do the bolts first, pull it down, and then remove your spring clamp. I would highly suggest getting something underneath this to catch any coolant that might still be in here, because this is a spot that isn't easy to remove the coolant from, just from draining it at normal spots. So get ready for a little bit more liquid to come out. Now we've gotten the actual hard lines off. The next step is going to be removing all of the OEM rubber lines that come from where the hard lines used to be, what those connected to, and what those connect to your heat exchanger lines, okay? And so when we do this, there's going to be one, let me turn this around here. Remember the lines went straight down the center, one went left, one went right, and if I can zoom in here, I'll try and get a video from up top. You can see right there, there's that line, the one with the sheathing on it, that's directly over the drip pan. That literally just goes around, if you're underneath the car, that goes around the side, and that's what connects to the hose that we installed earlier that runs all the way over here and hooks back into the, let's see here, that hooks into the bottom port of the heat exchanger, okay? Because that is your that's hot water coming in, okay? The top line, this line that kind of comes down, that is your cold water exiting. The cold water comes out of the top of the heat exchanger, hot water goes in the bottom. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna remove all that stuff that's in there. You can see it's zip tied. We're gonna get all that off, and we're gonna get ready to run the new lines. But before we run new lines, we're gonna have to do some stuff with the water pump. We'll show you that in a bit. But for right now, I'm gonna go ahead and get under there. I'm gonna disconnect that. So there's that line. There's also a line that comes off of this right here and kind of snakes its way through this part of the car and over into here, and we're going to disconnect that, and then I'll tell you guys what the next step is. We're under the car looking at the passenger side. So we've already disconnected. This is the one that connected to the passenger side hard line, and as you can see, let me zoom this out a little bit, all this line does is run around here, around your radiator support, and comes over here, and that connects to the line we've already installed that connects to our heat exchanger. So we're going to be unclipping this from how we mounted it to the radiator so that it can hang down, and then this will just literally fall out here, and we'll be able to disconnect it at the fittings and whatnot. And then we'll come over here, we'll disconnect it from this fitting here, and eventually we're going to disconnect it from the heat exchanger from underneath. It might be a little tricky getting up there, but we're doing everything we can to not have to remove the bumper. So we're going to do that, and then after that, I'll show you guys the driver's side once I get repositioned. We just got our hot return line off, and that's what this is right here. Let me zoom this out. I'm still wearing rubber gloves. So this is our hot return line setup. I'm still going to disconnect it completely, but what I did was I just disconnected it from that U-turn hose that we got from MercRacing. As you can see, there's still some coolant there in the bottom of the MercRacing heat exchanger. And the only reason I had a crazy spill is because my end of my hose slipped out of my drain pan, so I got to clean that up. But you can see here I've got it draining from the bottom of the heat exchanger. And grab that clamp. Let this drain completely and out of the way. Make sure you crack the bleeder valve at the top of your heat exchanger so you get airflow to let this let this jaw all drip out. So we're gonna get all that. We're gonna remove this, and then we're gonna start to work on the driver's side of the heat exchanger, the pipe that comes out of the driver's side, which is your cold exit return, and get that all off and remove the stock piping from there. We just finished getting off the hot line of the hot coolant line connected to the heat exchanger off, so that's completely off. And by the way, it is a pain in the butt to get the stuff off of the heat exchanger here, simply because the bracket holding on the pipes were facing the front of the bumper, so I had to really get my hands up in there. But it took me a little bit, but I was able to do it with a small ratchet and an 8mm socket, and still infinitely easier than taking the bumper off. But now we're gonna be working on removing the cold line. So that's the top port there that comes off of the heat exchanger. And let's really pay attention here, and I'm gonna show you guys a bunch of stuff here, because this is where it starts to get a little complicated. So we're gonna remove it there, and then that wraps around the radiator support over to the other side of the car here. So let me get under and show you guys a few things. So if you see, it's right there. That wraps around the radiator support, and you can see that's the line there, and it goes up to a T-fix right there, okay? So you see that T-fix, remember that. Now you see this line coming off here, where I got the hot spot of my flashlight, that goes over to this T-fix, all right? So I need you guys to think about these two T-fixes, because this is really important here. This T-fix here is the one that your OEM reservoir comes down to. This bottom line right here that my hot spot is on right there, that goes straight down and connects into your radiator, okay? So that is the coolant flow going into your engine. This T-fix right here, let me move around my light so I can actually point with my hand here. All right, so this T-fix right here, we are gonna be removing this line here completely. We're gonna get this off. We've got a rubber cap to go over this and seal it there. That will isolate the engine supply of coolant from the OEM reservoir. It'll literally just come straight down and into the radiator, and we'll be done with that, okay? The next thing we're gonna have to do, this line comes over here, and that goes to this T-fix here, okay? Now, there's a line that comes out of the bottom here. That line that comes out of the bottom is what connects to your heat exchanger. That is your cold water exit line that goes from here to this T-fix, and that goes into our secondary intercooler over here, which we're going to talk about in a bit, and then back to your supercharger. We are going to be deleting this T completely. This hose is going to go away. This T is going to go away. We're getting rid of this OEM line here completely. And then once we're done with that, basically what I'm going to do next is I'm going to remove this line completely. And after that, I'm going to go over here. I'm going to remove this line. I'm going to put the cap on. And once I have that all done, we're going to talk about what we're going to do with this T by removing it, and then what we're going to do over here. So to recap, take this hose off, put a cap on here. Disconnect this hose from this T, or we're just going to delete this altogether. We're going to remove this hose here because that comes down and underneath and around, and that's what connects to the heat exchanger. We're going to remove that. So that's what we're doing right now, and we'll be back with you once it's done. Okay guys, I'm going to film this hopefully in a way that makes sense for you guys so you can see what I'm talking about. Let me get my light. We just removed the cold line off of the heat exchanger, okay? So let's look at this. So this right here, that's your cold line that goes from your heat exchanger, and that goes around the radiator support, and it goes up here behind these lines to this T-fitting. All right, the T-fitting right here, it's kind of hard to see. Let's see if I can find a better angle for you guys. The right line, we're gonna talk about in a second, but off this T-fitting, the piece that goes to the left, that literally just connects into the top of your coolant pump, okay? So remember that. The other thing that we just connected was this line here. This line connects to that other T-fitting. This is the one that we're gonna be putting a cap on, right? That connected there. We're gonna put a cap there, seal it off, and then this line will just be dedicated engine coolant. That's what your OEM reservoir is going to connect to, so that's gone. So we don't have to disconnect all these other spring clamps here. The only other thing we have to disconnect now to get all this stuff out of the way is over by the coolant pump. So let me get over here and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so get my lighting right. We're now in the driver's side wheel well. This is the hose that comes off the left side of that other T-fitting. We just gotta do that, undo that spring clamp, pull it off, and then all that OEM tubes and hoses will come out, okay? So once we do that and we get that off, we're going to be taking this cap. This is supplied by MercRacing. And we take this cap and a clamp, and this is gonna go on that other T-fitting to isolate the engine coolant supply with the OEM reservoir. And then we're gonna have to do a couple more things before we set up our new Divorced Reservoir. So let me get this on, let me get all the old tubing out, be right back. All right, we got the top of that line pulled off, and you can see that the whole contraption has come out, but it's still kind of stuck here. And that's because one thing that we didn't talk about yet, just because it would be a little bit too confusing at the point that we were in, so I can get my light right, is that part of this coolant line, you can see here, that's the one that connected. So this line right here, the one that I'm pointing at with my index finger, that's the one that connected to that other T-fitting. And then this line here on the bottom, this is the one that went around to the heat exchanger. And then this one, this is the one that came off of the hard line that we disconnected in the very beginning. That one, what that one does, remember, that's a return line. So this was your this was your cold water going into the coolant pump. That comes out, that goes into this little secondary intercooler here. We haven't talked about this yet. And that comes out, and that is going to the hard lines that go up to your your supercharger. So what do we do with this secondary intercooler and all these lines here? We're gonna get rid of it. There's no need to have it when you divorce this setup, okay? So we're gonna take this line off of here. And by the way, you can remove this thing if you want to, but you have to take off the front bumper. We're not going to do that. I don't care about getting it out of here. So what we're going to do is we're going to disconnect this spring clamp. And you can see, by the way, that the coolant pump is full of coolant. So keep that in mind as you mess with this. I've got my drain pan underneath. The whole time you're messing with this, there's always residual coolant that's going to be coming out. But we're going to take this and we're going to remove it. Remember, coolant's going to come out of this and out of this because there's coolant inside of this. We're going to disconnect the lines at the top on each side of this. And actually what I'm probably going to do, since this has bends in it already, I'm going to take this, I'm going to delete this, get rid of it. I'm going to take this line, bring it up, I'm going to connect it to the top here so that's just a closed loop so that whatever's in here can't come out and it'll be contained there and I can just leave it there. And that way I don't have to worry about coolant spilling or anything like that. And then we're going to move on to the next step. But that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to get rid of this, pull out this whole chunk of stuff. I don't know why Audi made it so damn complicated. We're going to disconnect this, move this up to here to connect that loop. So this isolates that secondary intercooler, makes it useless, completely deletes it out of the loop. And then we're going to move on to the next step. We are nearing the end of our journey here. We're not quite there, but the light's at the end of the tunnel. So as you can see, we got the lines completely removed from the coolant pump. I did what I said I was going to do. I took this line, which was connected here, and I just rerouted it, took it up here and connected it to the other side of the secondary intercooler that we don't need anymore, just to close the loop. That way nothing's going to come out of this thing because there's definitely still coolant in there. We're just not going to use it. I'm not taking it out. I'm not draining it. There's no easy way to drain it without taking it out. And so I'm just closing that loop off and we're done. So now all we have to do now is run lines for everything. What we have to do though, if you look, this is aiming the wrong way now. Our heat exchanger's over there. This line is going to go directly into the heat exchanger. It's going to go into the hot line. So the hot fluid is going to be connected, like the line that comes from the hot part of the heat exchanger. So the bottom port is going to go directly from that into this. Now, you can use one of those silicone U-shaped lines, which could connect here and just go right around and over there. That's the easiest way to do this if you have an extra one of those. but at the same time, that's creating distance that fluid has to travel, and that's going to take away from recovery. I'm sure it would not be a huge difference, but to do this right and do it by the book, I am going to reverse this. So there's 2 ways of doing this. We can take the whole thing apart and spin the entire pump around, or Jose was telling me we can just undo these 4 screws. They look like T15s. You undo those 4, and you can literally just spin this top piece all the way around and then sink them back down. And since we have a lot of clearance here, I think that's what I'm going to do, because we have a whole lot of room here, and I think I'm going to try that first and spin it around. Whenever we did this, there's a lot of coolant in this, and a lot of it came out. I even took my shop vac and I put it up to this to pull whatever coolant I could out so that it should be pretty well and drained. So keep that in mind. So once we're going to do that, we're going to spin that around. We're going to start running lines. This is a hot line, so this is going to go to the hot port of the heat exchanger. Out of the top, this is literally just going to go out of the top and into our coolant reservoir. Our coolant reservoir is going to be sitting right about here. We'll talk about that in a little bit, show you how to mount it up. So that'll just be a straight line from here to the bottom of the reservoir. And yeah, so we're going to go ahead and get this spun back around and start to measure lines and cut them, and be right back. I just removed the 4 bolts or 4 screws that hold the top of this on. They are T20s, 4 of them on there. I don't have torque settings for putting them back on there, but I can tell you they weren't incredibly tight on there. It was just basically hand tight. So if you grab this and you kind of rock it, you can see it just pops right off. I will say that when you're doing this and you're going to go put this back on and tighten them down, get them all started, and then go slowly, bit by bit, go one here, go across, go here, go across, so that it tightens down square evenly. So we have that. Let's pop this off. I'll let you guys see what that looks like. There's nothing in this. You can see the pump turbine there, and literally we're just going to take this and we're going to spin it that way so it's aiming at the heat exchanger. You can see we got that, and we just literally press that back on, and now we can take our screws and we can very easily put this back on there and tighten this down. Just be very careful, make sure it goes on evenly and it's sealed all the way around. So I'm going to get that tightened back down, and we'll start to connect some lines. Okay, so now we've got the coolant pump reoriented to where the hot line is exiting towards the heat exchanger. That's going to make running that line a lot easier. And now we're at the fun part. Now we get to connect everything and create our supercharger coolant loop. So we basically have 4 main lines to run. The first one, we are going to be running the hot line from the coolant pump to the bottom port of the heat exchanger. That is the hot entry port on the heat exchanger. Remember, hot fluid goes in the bottom of the heat exchanger, cold fluid comes out of the top port. That's the next line we're going to run. That is a direct line from the cold exit of the heat exchanger up to the cold entry of the crossover pipe on the supercharger. Okay. The next thing we have to do is we have to install our new MercRacing Divorced Reservoir. We put that in, and I'll show you how we're going to do that with the bracket. And once that's in there, we're going to be running a line straight out of the bottom of it. And let me show it to you. You can see there's 2 lines, and this is meant for multiple applications. We've got a block on here. We're only going to be using this one. We're going to be running a line straight out of that. That is going to go into this T fitting. Okay. That line's there's going to be a line that connects here to here. And then off the bottom here, we're going to have another line that goes from there to the top of the coolant pump. The line that comes off of this side is going to be your hot exit line from the supercharger. So there's going to be that exit line from your crossover pipe coming from your supercharger that connects to this, and that's what's going to flow hot water back into the coolant pump to recirculate through your heat exchanger and continue to supply your supercharger with cold water. So 4 main sections, not complicated to do here. You just have to make sure that you route the lines in a way that they don't get kinked. I'll show you what I do as I connect it all. The only other line that we're going to be running is going to be off of the top of the supercharger, off of the top of the heat exchanger that connects to this. And this is what's going to allow this entire system to bleed itself after you do the initial fill. And we'll talk about that when we get there. But that's going to be the last line we run for the DIY. So I'm going to get into this and start connecting lines. Okay, so we got the hot coolant line ran. So we're coming off of the bottom port of the heat exchanger, which is our hot exit line. And you can see that it's routed right here above this little support bar, comes over here, comes up, and it connects to this kind of not really right angle, but downturn silicone pipe. So I made this piece out of one of the silicone U pieces, actually the one that came off of here that wrapped straight around the back. And I basically just cut small, tested it, cut small, tested it. I'm sure Jose will come out with a legit piece that fits this for these cars eventually, but if you have to piece this together yourself, you need something that can come down, and you don't want it to kink. That's the big thing. You don't want this to kink at all. This piece here is about 17.5 inches long. Now, don't cut your line 17.5 inches long thinking it'll fit perfectly, because remember, it depends on how you mount your heat exchanger. I've got the S6 heat exchanger, so that fits a little differently. If you've got just a regular 3.0t heat exchanger, it's gonna be different. So you're gonna have to kind of play around with that. I'm sure that if you order the install kit, you'll get enough line that you can play around with it. But remember, you wanna measure all the way up from the butt of the heat exchanger all the way to the fitting. So got 1, 2, 3, 4 clamps on here, and that one's done. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to install the reservoir and get that lined up, and then we'll start to connect that to the coolant pump. So in order to install the reservoir, we have to have a bracket, and we have the original first prototype bracket for this system that we had made here locally in Wilmington, North Carolina by Barrel Maker Caddy. I'll link to his Instagram in the description. Local metalsmith, does awesome work for all us local guys. He fabbed this up for us, and we sent the dimensions off to Jose MercRacing. So this is what's going to come. It comes originally just perfectly straight, but we kind of played around with the fitment, and we determined that once you get on, if you bend it slightly, it'll center up the reservoir right here. So the reservoir is going to come in right here between your radiator support bracket and your OEM reservoir. And if you see those two bolts right there, let me zoom in here. Ooh, a little much. We're going to connect this to those right here. That's going to go right there and connect. And then that will allow us to connect the reservoir to the upper part. So pretty excited about this. We're just going to remove those bolts, connect that there, and then put those nuts back on, and then we'll be able to attach the reservoir to this. Okay, this isn't the most perfect angle ever, but you can see the bolts we're going to be working on, and that's really all you need to see. They are 10mm nuts, and so I've got a ratcheting wrench here. I think that'll be the easiest thing, and we'll get these removed. But it should just loosen up a little bit. So got that loosened. We're going to get the bracket. We'll put that on, and we'll get the nuts tightened back onto it. All right, we got our bracket, so let's get it fitted. I was going to paint it, but I just didn't get around to painting it. So going to put that there, get these nuts started, and then we'll tighten them down. Now, once again, this is the prototype bracket, and it's going to be plenty sturdy to hold the reservoir even filled with water, but it's also not so stiff that you can't adjust this. So once you get it in, you get it locked in, and you get your reservoir on, you should be able to bend it a little bit to get the perfect fitment for your engine bay. I'm going to tighten these down, and then we'll come back to installing the actual reservoir. Okay, good and tight. It's real easy to want to just go ahead and mount this up, but before we do that, we want to be smart about this and make this job as easy as possible. Remember, we've got to run a line out of the bottom of this that goes down into the coolant pump. And if I can get this tilted over real quick, hold on one second. Let me just get this out of the camera mount. Okay, so if we look straight down here, you can see that's our coolant pump, right? And so we have to have a line that comes down. Remember, there's gonna be a T-fitting between the reservoir and that coolant pump. So the best thing to do here is to measure the distance from this to the bottom of the reservoir to the best of our ability. And what we can do is we just do a guess. This will be a guesstimate of a distance. We're just gonna measure it. So we're gonna just kind of hold this up and see, okay, if it mounts there, we look over here, we need to measure up to about 2 inches off the top of the frame there. Also, by the way, this piece here that your bracket is screwed in between here with these nuts, that's no like critical suspension piece or anything. That's actually the bracket that holds that secondary intercooler in. So you don't need to really worry about that thing getting messed up too much. You do want it to be secure though, so it doesn't rattle around. So let's go ahead and measure. I'm going to pull out my measuring stick here just long enough so I can do this one-handed to show you guys. This would be a lot easier if I was just doing this by myself. I'm going to just go to the top of the housing of the coolant pump, and I'm just going to measure pretty much to just underneath the first hole in the mounting bracket, and that's about 12.5 inches. So I'm going to start off that coolant line that I'm going to run there as 12.5 inches. I know that'll be more than enough, and then as I get this put together and get the T-fitting and everything, I'll be able to just cut it and fit it all in there. Remember, cut large, then trim down. Don't cut too small, because then you got to have a new piece, and I don't know how much you're going to have to play around with. So we're going to get this back on there. All right, as you can see, we've got our line connected here, and what we're going to do is I'm going to run this down and check it out and just make sure that I'll have plenty of room to go in on the bottom and actually cut it to trim, and there's plenty of open space underneath there, so we're good to go ahead and attach the reservoir to the bracket. Got everything clamped up under here on the bottom, so we're going to use the supplied 10mm screws here and push them through the top of the bracket, and we're going to get them started. I should probably switch hands here so I have more room. Sorry about that. Okay, so now that you've got this in, you do have some room to play here if you wanted to bend this over and whatnot and get it centered, but I've got it there in the middle and it looks good. This is the prototype bracket. It's got a little bit of play, but not a ton. But we'll look at potentially maybe getting something made out of a little bit thicker steel or something to hold that nice and in place. Don't forget to attach this back on if you took it off. At this point in the install, I'm gonna have to change gears. I can't finish connecting the reservoir to the coolant pump and feeding the other lines because my supercharger isn't on the car. And I can't get an accurate measurement of lines and how I need to route them until it's on there with the crossover pipe in place. So I'm going to move on now to installing the line that's going to allow the heat exchanger to auto bleed in the supercharger loop. So we got this tubing here. It's gonna go from here across. We're gonna route it right here beneath the radiator support over and into this barb. But one thing we're gonna install is this flow control valve. The reason we have to have a flow control valve on this is because when the water's coming through, if there's no flow control on this, it's just gonna gush into the reservoir and it's gonna create a lot of bubbles. And that creates air, which you don't want air to circulate back in, right? We're trying to bleed that air out. And we'll talk about how high you need to fill your reservoir whenever you're going to fill it. But so we're going to get a little bit of tube, put it on this barb. We're going to connect the flow control valve there, and then we're going to run the rest of it over here. And this fitting is going to replace our bleed valve that's on the heat exchanger down here. We're going to put Teflon tape on here, screw this in, and then we'll connect this over here. We're going to put a probably black zip tie on here just to hold it in place, but it is got like a little barb fitting there, and we're going to get this all connected up. What we're going to start first is putting this fitting down into the bleed port of the heat exchanger. One thing you guys can do before you actually install this fitting is you can go ahead and if you have all your other lines connected, so like if you have your lines connected to your supercharger and you have a closed system, you can go ahead and fill this with whatever you plan on running in your supercharger coolant loop. So if you're running just distilled water, put a funnel in here and fill the heat exchanger up. That's going to save you a lot of time bleeding this, because that's a big thing to get all that air out of. So I would suggest doing that before you put this fitting on, because once the fitting's on, you cannot do that through the bleed port there. Okay, we've got our fitting. We've got Teflon tape on there, so we're going to go ahead and put this in. When it finishes, you want it to be aiming towards the reservoir. So we go all the way here, and that seems nice and tight. That's on there good. So that's good to go. Now we can attach some tubing and we can run it over towards the reservoir. So we're going to take our hose, we're going to go ahead and put it onto here. And that's a pretty tight fit, so I'm going to get a little bit of soapy water to spray on there. Make life just a little bit easier for us. There you go. Push it all the way flush to the fitting. And like I said, I'm going to use a zip tie to tighten this up. I wish I had black, but I only got white. Find the end of the barb. We're going to put it right up against that barb. And trim it off. And now we're going to route the rest of the line into the engine bay. And I'm just going to come right over here. Let me turn this so you can see. You see this little guard, I don't know what you would call that, but we're going to go right inside of it. And we're going to push through the radiator support and pull the rest of the tube through. Now remember, we want this to come through. We don't want it sagging and we don't want it rubbing on metal. There's that metal corner there, so we need to be careful. We can't really bring it on top there because the cover for the engine won't be able to close. So give it a little bit of slack here and bring it in. And now we can work on connecting the flow control valve and then getting this connected to the actual reservoir. By the way, I talked to Jose just a little bit ago. This is a little too loose for what we want. It's gonna be just fine to run the car, but I'm gonna go to my metal guy and get a thicker gauge piece of metal for the bracket and eventually replace it on there so that I don't have that bouncing around quite as much. But I'll still be able to run the car just fine. Before we attach this, I wanna make sure you guys know how this works. I mean, it's a pretty simple machine here, and you can actually kind of see in there, you can see that it's closed. When I turn this handle in line with the fittings, you can see it opens up. And then it doesn't matter if I turn it this way, as you can see it's closed, or if I turn it this way, it's closed. And this right here is going to allow you to fine tune how fast the water flows back into your reservoir so that you don't make a bunch of bubbles. But anyways, let's go ahead and get this attached. I'm just going to put this basically where I can access it, so probably about right here. So it looks like we only need about 4 inches of tubing, and this is 1/4 inch tubing, so I'm going to cut about 4 inches off and connect this real quick. All right, and these are good barbed fittings here, so this should have no problem going on and staying on. You can do another zip tie if you want to hold this on, which I might do that just to be safe, just to be overly cautious. And then this will go onto this fitting here. Push it all the way up. And we've got our flow control valve installed. Now, once we have that installed, we just need to connect the line here. So we just need to cut that. And to remember, we don't want anything to kink up, so make sure it's got some play and make sure it's loose. And we will get this connected and tightened up, and we'll be done with this part. I decided to shorten this up just a little bit more to get this placed a little bit better for my liking. And once again, we're gonna leave plenty of room to where this doesn't kink up. That looks good to me there. I could probably be using something easier to cut this, but oh well. This is what I use to cut the coolant lines, the big thick ones. So we put this together here, and we are done with connecting the auto bleed lines. I am going to put some zip ties on these to hold them because they're a little bit loose here, and we'll put one there just to be safe, and eventually I'll replace them with black zip ties. I'm going to go ahead and do that, but we're done with that. Okay, another day, and we now have the supercharger back on the car so we can start to work on wrapping up the lines to finish this coolant overhaul. For those of you that don't know, check the diagram, but you have your crossover pipe here for the supercharger. The top line, that is your hot water outline. The bottom line and bottom port, that is your cold water end line. So the way we're gonna run this, we're gonna run one line from the hot water outline. That's gonna go down this way, down into the engine bay, underneath your frame arm, and it's gonna connect to a T-fix that we're gonna show you that's just under your new reservoir. The bottom line here, that's gonna go the same direction. It's gonna go down and underneath and around your radiator support, and that's gonna connect directly to the cold water outline on your heat exchanger. The big thing here when you run these lines is you cannot allow them to bend and choke off any coolant flow. So you need to do something that allows them to curve over to the driver's side of the engine. We got this U-shaped piece, the 180-degree silicone hose from MercRacing, and what we did was we basically cut it, not perfectly in the middle of the apex, but just slightly, and we're gonna use these to create these bends. So when I do it, this piece is gonna go on the cold water line, this one's gonna go on the hot water line like that, so that this creates a nice unrestricted flow to the driver's side of the car, and then we can trim up these ends to connect and use our fittings to connect to the actual coolant hose and run it down. So I'm gonna go ahead and get these attached to the car. We're gonna trim these up and start running hose, and I'll show you exactly how that's gonna look. Okay, so we have our right angles installed to the crossover pipe. We've got our hot line and our cold line, and these are good. We already tested and pushed them down to make sure that they don't bend or kink up here at all. I've got some coolant hose cut. This one I measured for the cold line going from the heat exchanger to the supercharger. I'm basically going to attach it up here and feed it down there and then run it around, and as long as it doesn't kink up anywhere and I get it connected, then we'll be done with that one. It'll be good to go. After that, we'll measure out some hose to connect to this, and this is going to run down under the control or the frame arm and go over to this side of the engine bay so it can connect underneath the new reservoir where the T-fix is, and we'll get a different angle to show you what that's all about when we get there. So I just got the cold water line connected. So that's our cold water line going into the supercharger, and it's coming off the cold water port, which is this port at the that goes to the bottom from the heat exchanger. And I'll show you from the top. You can see how it just goes straight down. I've got these clamps here. They're kind of rubbing up here. I mean, I don't think it's a big deal, but I'll probably spin those around a little bit so they're not just sitting on those too hard. But I'm going to go underneath the car and show you how I routed that pipe. So give me 1 second. Okay, so now we're underneath the car. I know it might be a little hard to see, but you can see, actually, sorry, it's the wrong spot. Here we go. So you can see this line right here is the cold water line, and it comes down underneath the frame arm, and it comes right here on top of the hot water exit line that we have connected to the pump. And you can see it kind of comes right over here and connects to the heat exchanger. Just finished connecting the last few lines of this divorced supercharger coolant system. I want to show you what I did. Obviously I showed you this line. We already did that one that went down. That's our cold water line. Our hot water line here comes off. Connected it here. There's the typical metal fittings, and what I did, since this is resting on top of it, I didn't want that metal fittings or both of those to be rubbing up all this rubber, so I took some packaging styrofoam, wrapped it around there, and then zip tied it on there. That way nothing will rub holes in it. But anyways, took that, and instead of going down the same path and under the arm, I went over it and down this cavity here. And let me come outside over here and show you exactly what happened. It is thunderstorming, so you probably hear that in the background. But we go over here, and you can see what's going on here. So you see that T-fitting in the middle. Obviously, the line that's coming from the top of it up, that connects to the reservoir. You can see it up there. Then I've got the line connecting it to the coolant pump, and then the T-fitting comes off to the right, and that's what our hot water line is connecting to. Now you see that elbow there, the 90-degree elbow right there. That doesn't come with a kit. That's actually something I took off of the stock coolant hoses, because otherwise I'd have had to try and route something, because I didn't have any other 90-degree elbows or anything I could have used to go back vertically, and I didn't want to route the coolant line crazy different directions. And so I went and I grabbed that. I'll show you what I grabbed it from so you can reference yours. I'll walk over here to my table. Some good thunder. All right, you see this mess of stuff here? I grabbed it off of this T-fitting right here. There was a 90-degree elbow. It's the same diameter of the hose that we're using, 3/4. You can see on the ground there. Took that. Sorry about that, technical difficulties with my microphone. But anyways, I took that 90-degree elbow and I just repurposed it to allow me to have a vertical line coming straight down. That way I have no bends, no kinks in the system. So right now, we are completely done running coolant lines. Everything is tied down. Everything looks good. Nothing's rubbing on anything it should be rubbing on. The only thing I need to do is zip tie my wiring harness back up into place. And once I get that done, we're gonna start filling this up, checking for leaks, and starting to bleed the system. Okay, now it's time to actually fill the supercharger coolant system up, and we have to bleed the supercharger coolant loop separately from the engine loop. Okay, so the engine loop is literally, you're just going to fill this up. We're going to bleed from the heater core bleed port in the very back. Everything else we're going to be bleeding is going to be bled through the supercharger intercooler bleed screws back there, and we're going to use the auto bleeding function of the heat exchanger with this flow control valve going into the reservoir to aid us in bleeding this. Apparently it's supposed to be really easy, but you do have to do an initial fill. Hopefully, if you got everything lined up and whatnot, you pre-filled your heat exchanger. By the way, I am doing this in the middle of a thunderstorm, so pardon the the random interruptions from Mother Nature. But anyways, if you're pre-filled this is going to go a lot faster for you. Mine's not pre-filled because of the way I filmed this, so everything is just full of air right now. So the way Jose explained it to me is we're going to pour this in, fill this up, and let it fill up as much as possible until it starts to actually fill the reservoir. And then after that, you need to activate your coolant pump, which for me, my PWM wire is disconnected on my CW100. So all I have to do is hit the unlock button on my remote and it'll automatically turn the coolant pump on and start cycling water. Now it's gonna bring the reservoir levels down, and as it brings it down, you need to add water. You're trying not to let any air get in there, but if you do, it's no big deal. Just keep adding water, let it go through. But when you fill this, and I'll show you a bird's eye view once we get this going, what you don't want to do is fill it up too high. So this bleed port right here, or not this bleed port, but this port right here that has your flow control valve, let me zoom in on it. This right here, you want the water underneath that, maybe about an inch below that, okay? You don't need to have a ton of water in here because you need room to let that water go up and down. People have mentioned that divorce systems create more pressure on the intercooler brakes and cause them to fail. Yeah, if there's no room for the coolant to move as pressure builds and subsides, then you're gonna exert more pressure. But if you leave room in here, then you're gonna have plenty of room for that water level to rise and fall as pressure builds and rises, and you're not gonna do any damage. So you want that water level when you're all said and done to be about an inch below this. I'm gonna go and start filling it and do this. And once I do, I'll bring the camera back and show you what's going on, and we'll go from there. One important note, when you're filling this, you can do it with G13, 50/50. You can do straight water. If you do water, and anytime you're gonna use water, because if you have to mix your coolant, if you have the concentrator or whatnot, it has to be distilled water. You cannot use regular water because it has minerals in it and it'll corrode the inside of your coolant system. So it has to be distilled water. You wanna pay attention to how much you're using, pour it in there, but once again, word of caution, if you live in a cold weather climate, do not leave just straight water in your system during cold temperatures below freezing, because if it freezes, the water will expand and it will break a lot of stuff in your motor and you're gonna have a bad day. So if you're in a cold weather environment, do some kind of a mix that will be safe for your environment. Please keep that in mind. But for me, I'm in southeastern North Carolina. It's hot as hell. I'm going straight with distilled water so I can get the most cooling effects. I'm also gonna be putting some water wetter in it once I figure out exactly how much water I'm using so I know how much to add. This is very cool. I'm gonna hopefully get this in shot for you. You can see this going on. So you can see the water pumping into the reservoir, and you can see how there's different like spurts of air coming through, and that's the system bleeding itself out. I actually don't have my supercharger bleed ports open at all. It's just literally removing air from the system. And I'm gonna keep just doing this. I'm gonna keep hitting my unlock button on my keys and keep running this water through it. Now, if you don't have your PWM wire disconnected to where this just turns on when you unlock your car, you can just open your car door. When you open your car door, it primes your pump and it will turn your coolant pump on. That should get the trick done. So just do this until you don't see that surge anymore, and you should be able to see it just be straight water flowing through. Trying to get a better shot of in there. All right, so you see it stop now. You see those bubbles? I'm gonna have to adjust that flow control valve there to stop those bubbles from forming. But first, right now, I'm just concerned with getting as much of the air out as possible. So here, I'm gonna hit my unlock button. And there we go. And you can see that the reservoir is never getting empty of water down there. I need to add just a little bit more. But so far, it's taken about a gallon total. Remember, I've got the S6 heat exchanger. But I'm going to keep doing this, and I'll check in once I am satisfied that this thing is fully bled. Okay, so after you've got a good amount of water in there, whatever you're using, it's still pink because there was always residual coolant in there. But what you want to make sure you do, if you remember the video that you just saw, you saw it super bubbly, and there was a lot of just like a lot of pressure coming out. I was hitting that pipe in the middle and just creating a lot of bubbles. But now you can see it's kind of calmed down a little bit. That's because I used that control valve there and I really reduced the flow. And you can see it's pretty much just a steady flow, steady trickle. And you can see there, air is still coming out, so it's still bleeding the system slowly. So now what I've done is I'm not just using the keys to keep my coolant pump on. I've actually turned the car, just the ACC power on. Haven't started the car because I don't have any coolant in the engine right now. But I've just put the ACC power on with the door open so that it just constantly runs here. And I'm going to let it just bleed until we got good clear water. But you can see every once in a while some air comes out. And so we know it's doing its job. And I need to monitor this as the water goes down. As air gets pulled out, the water level is going to go down. I need to make sure it doesn't get so far down that it sucks air. Once it gets nice and clear, I'm going to put a little bit of extra water in there, and then I'm going to bleed the supercharger screws, and then we should be done with this supercharger coolant loop bleed procedure. It takes a little bit of time, but it's super, super easy to do once you get that bleed or that flow valve at the right pace. So while this is doing this, I'm going to go ahead and start filling up my engine with 50/50 coolant and getting ready to start the car and fully bleed that while this finishes. While my supercharger coolant loop is processing and bleeding itself out, I'm going to go ahead and start to fill up the engine now, just using regular 50/50 water to coolant mix, your regular G13 50/50. I'm going to start to fill it up, and then as it starts to fill up in the reservoir, I'll go ahead and grab the pliers to go bleed the heater core bleed port, and everything's cold right now, so it's not going to be a true bleed, but it'll get us to the point where I'll be able to start the engine after I put it back on the ground and then do a full bleed of the engine. So I'm going to go ahead and work on that. It's been a few days since we've completed the coolant system overhaul and divorced the system. And I want to show you what this coolant, or what your water is supposed to look like whenever it's fully bled. So if I can get in here without a glare, you see how clear it is? Let's see here. See how perfectly clear it is down there? And you can see it's just clear water coming in. It's still got a little bit of a pink hue. I've got water wetter in there. There was some residual coolant, but it's mainly distilled water. There's no bubbles whatsoever. It's not cloudy whatsoever. And that's a result of the system auto bleeding from your heat exchanger into that reservoir. And you might notice what looks like some coolant residual spray or whatever. Looks like it exploded. And that's because the second day after doing this line right here, which I took off to run the lines, I guess I didn't put this piece back on and secure it properly. Ran the car for a couple days, and then I parked it actually at a Volkswagen Audi meet, and it just blew off, and coolant from the OEM reservoir just went everywhere. Luckily, I haven't had a Volkswagen Audi meet because someone there had some G13 that I was able to top my system off with. So if you remove this, make sure you secure that all the way, or else you're gonna have a really dirty engine bay, and it's gonna smell like coolant for a few days. So anyways, overall, I'm really, really loving this divorce setup. It's working great. We've done some logs. You can find the links to those in the description. If you have any questions on how we did this and what my thoughts are on it, feel free to leave a comment below, message us on Instagram, something like that. Make sure you like and follow the channel. And thank you guys once again for all the support over the past few years, especially recently. And we'll keep you updated on how this works. Okay guys, so we got the car fully up and running, put back together. I'm topping it off with some gas before I take it on the highway. First impressions of the whole setup so far. The first thing I noticed is that the IATs are just low. Typically when the car is not going fast, it's just at city driving, I'm seeing IAT temperatures of about anywhere from 115 to 130, depending on how hot it is, depending on how slow I'm going. And it's been idling in my garage for about 25 minutes, and then I just drove it up here to the gas station, which is only a couple miles, didn't get over 50 miles an hour, and it's sitting right around 99 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's already showing a lot lower temperatures. The other thing I noticed is that even just getting on the gas a little bit, that little bit of gas brought the IATs down. Like immediately I saw like 3 degrees drop. So I'm gonna let this top off with gas and go out on the interstate and see what the cruising temperatures are, then I'll give a little bit of a pull and see what they go up to. I'm not going to do crazy testing tonight because the roads are wet. It's been a long night. I got an early day tomorrow, but I'll get a little bit of data, and then another day when I got some time to actually go out and do some logs and pulls, I will get that done and see what this does. Okay guys, so I wanted to show you what my IATs are at interstate speeds. This is a few days after I did the install, so I've had plenty of time for the auto bleed to purge any air left over in my supercharger coolant loop. But if we look here, you can see that my IATs are 19 degrees above ambient temperature in 93-degree weather. And actually they just lowered a little bit more. Check this out. That is freaking sweet. So I'm gonna get some logs done and see what happens when I'm actually doing some quarter-mile runs and see what they peak at. All right guys, so we're in the car right now. I've got kind of a rigged up camera system here to show you my P3 gauge. Car's been sitting for a little bit. It's at idle, and so the temperature up to about 132 degrees Fahrenheit for my IATs. I just popped into a store and I'm on the way back out. Ambient temperature is 85 degrees. When I was driving down here, my IATs were sitting right about 12 degrees over ambient. So I'm gonna take this video so you can see how quickly the IATs go down when I start driving. I've got my AC on because it's hot as balls outside, but I'm gonna get out here, get on the interstate. I'm gonna try and get my IATs down to a point where I can do a, a pull of some kind and show you what they go up to. But right now I'm still not going too fast. You can kind of see my speedometer over there, so you get an idea of how fast I'm going with the IATs moving. Okay, got one more car to pass. We're gonna get out here. All right, we're at 113, so not terrible. We'll go ahead and do an AMAX pull. So that was just going from 4th into the 5th gear there. Let's see what the max was. 174 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's still pretty high. I know a lot of you guys are talking about how your IATs are 155 max, and you saw that it held at 155, 160 there for quite a while up until the upper left. So I just wanted to jump in here real quick and tell you guys that I sent this little clip here of the IATs during the pull to Jose to show him how it was going, and talked about the peak temperature, which you saw once I hit the peak it showed 174 degrees Fahrenheit, I think. But if you pay attention to that pull, you'll see that the IATs hold steady at 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and they barely start to climb up into the 160s at the very end of the pull, right around 7,200 RPMs. And then once I let off the gas, there's a sharp spike in temperatures. And what that was, what Jose explained to me, is like once I let off the gas there, you're not getting any more cool air coming in through your intake, and so you're not only cutting off that cool air inflow that's being pulled in by the engine, but you're also getting radiant heat immediately pushed into the supercharger. So that's what that peak IAT temperature is there. So the car itself held 160 pretty much all the way through till the very last few bits of the RPMs, and kind of crept up a little bit, but it's still under the 80 degrees Celsius benchmark. So everything's looking good there. We are still potentially thinking that the car could be maybe about 5 to 10 degrees cooler, but since we've overhauled the entire system, we're not sure if we need to replace the actual sensors that measure the IATs, and they're not expensive, so just for the fun of it, I'm gonna go ahead and order a couple of them and throw them on and see if that makes any difference, because after that I really have no idea where we would go to figure out how to reduce the temperatures on my IATs anymore, because we've got brand new intercooler cores, the whole thing's been revamped, but I'll keep you guys posted on that.